Good morning. I'm Phyllis Martin, CEO of Tri-County Cradle to Career Collaborative. On behalf of the YWCA of Greater Charleston, E3, and Tri-County Cradle to Career, I am humbled and grateful to welcome you to this virtual discussion. I also want to express my thanks for your taking time and making time to participate in the second of a two-part series intended to build a pathway for all of us to discuss racial disparities and anti-racist solutions through a racial equity lens. This discussion adds to the first in the series, which was Moving to Systemic Change, another look at the Charleston Racial Disparities Report, and that took place in August of this year. I started my day this morning by reading a blog from a series called Refuse to Lose. And this blog is from another Cradle to Career organization in Tacoma, Washington called Graduate Tacoma. The landing page for the blog had these words as an introduction, and I think they're relevant as we begin this discussion, and I wanted to share them with you. Truth is essential. Truth is power. Truth is healing. Truth is courage. Truth is urgent. Truth is justice. Truth is now. It should come as no surprise to you then that with the help of Graduate Tacoma, Washington has led their community to closing the 33% Black-white graduation gap. And one of the contributing factors in their success is that Graduate Tacoma continues to advance its commitment to equity of opportunity for students of color in the era of COVID-19, and they have a renewed fight against racial oppression and violence. It's almost a year to the date that I joined Tri-County Cradle to Career. December 16th will be a year to the date that I attended my first board meeting and shared with the board at that time that if Cradle to Career was going to live its mission and vision, that we must make good on what the organization named in its fifth report to the community. And that is that systemic racism is the barrier for our region's Black and Brown children. And that as an organization and as individuals, we must commit to becoming an anti-racist organization and doing our best to ensure that all of TCC's work is equity-centered and focused. I fully acknowledge this morning that this is not where the organization started and not where the organization has been, but it is our journey now. And I hope and ask that you will hold me and the organization accountable. So as we prepare to dig into our region's history of K-12 public education, the words that I read earlier about truth stand out as foundational. We must understand the truth about the distinct power structures that existed and exist. We must understand our history together, understand the foundational thinking that racial disparities across sectors are firmly rooted in a system of white supremacy and therefore cannot be resolved until the system has been acknowledged, disrupted, and rebuilt with equity at the center. As we move forward today, we know that we will hear more about Blacks in the region. We would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathering virtually from many places in South Carolina, which is the land of many First Nations people, including Catawba, Edisto Nations, Yamasee, Kusabo, Cherokee, Kiowa, Siwi, Sampa, and Wando. Thank you so much for being here this morning and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I am Audrey Lane, and I am one of the partners of E3. I would first like to just say that you may see a lot of me today because my partner, Letitia Vaughn, has suffered a tragic loss in her family. So please send her thoughts and well wishes as we have been working on this series for several years. And this part, of course, is very intimate and important to both of us. So the anti-racism speaker series was birthed well before the exhausting list of pivotal events in 2020, sparking a necessary conversation about this new terminology known as anti-racism. For our team, we witnessed numerous efforts to make life better for Black and Brown people without Black and Brown people being at the table or strongly influencing or leading the work. One that many in South Carolina may remember is the Post and Courier series in August of 2019, known as the Minimally Adequate Special Report. Apathy, segregation, and disparities hold South Carolina schools back. Although a well thought out publication, shout out to Glenn Smith and his team, and series of articles, data collection, and anecdotal stories, the roadshow that followed the release of the series included many panels with various partners, institutes of higher education, and other entities across the state where the intended beneficiaries of an improved school system, i.e. Black and Brown children, and experts who can speak to these issues through lived experiences were not lifted up as the preeminent experts to solving these issues, thereby perpetuating a racial hierarchy or inequity. That being when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing, as outlined by Ibram Kendi. As a Black woman, born and raised in South Carolina, Columbia to be exact, Metro, stand up, I know that Black brilliance and expertise exists at the highest levels, and it was and still is necessary to highlight and value these perspectives if we are truly going to begin to change the outcomes for students of color and their families in this state and beyond. Therefore, in this speaker series, we are intentional about moving from symbolic or performative acts to systemic change through an anti-racist framework, a framework that supports anti-racist policy through our actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And an anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. It is our intent to interrogate the systems and policies and ideas causing years upon years of compounded racial inequities so that we can rebuild a system that has the direct outcome of racial equity. During the summer, we held a poignant conversation with two white women regarding allyship in this nation on the heels of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Then in August, we continued the series and revisited the Racial Disparities Report by the Avery Institute with Dr. Patricia Williams-Lassane and Mr. Darren Calhoun. This research and the recommendations focused on key areas such as education, where we will begin today with more in-depth discussions. We're excited about today's discussion, especially necessary to the unlearning of a narrative that Blacks in the South needed and may still need to be saved. As we learn and discuss, Dr. James Anderson outlines that literacy and formal education was viewed as a means of liberation and freedom for free persons of color and our enslaved ancestors. Then further in our time today, the magnificent Dr. Millicent Brown, a Charleston native, will help us gain a deeper understanding of our assumptions around desegregation and integration and the misconceptions associated with Black children during and after integration. But first, Mary, if you could go back to the ground rules. We will begin with our ground rules for our time together. If you have attended the Racial Equity Institute, these will be familiar to you. Give me 1 second to get back. So we will be proximate to the problem of racism in the United States. Again, we will look to change the narrative. We need to know the current shared narrative and be intimately aware of the narratives you have internalized. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. We all have to be willing to be uncomfortable. Embracing our own growing edge, and please know there is no quick fix. Next slide, Mary. But in November of 2020, all that we have endured up until this time, I smile because we still have to maintain hope in the face of all of these brutal facts. And I ask that you commit and engage today. Stay the whole time if you can. Be in the moment, alert and awake. I know this is Zoom heaven or purgatory for many of us at this point in November. But please try to participate appropriately, respectfully. Trust the process that we're going through, respect for all people, and if necessary, confidentiality. So our first speaker today is Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the Dean of the College of Education, the Edward William and Jane Marr Gutzgell Professor of Education and Affiliate Professor of History, African American Studies, and College of Law at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His scholarship focuses broadly on the history of U.S. education, with a subfield on the history of African American education. His book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, won the American Educational Research Association Outstanding Book Award in 1990. From 2006 to 2016, he served as senior editor of the History of Education Quarterly. He served as an advisor for and participant in the PBS documentary School, The Story of American Education, The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, Forgotten Genius, The Percy Julian Story, and Tell Them We Are Rising, The Story of Black Colleges and Universities. And in the fall of 2020, he was selected to join the Board of Trustees at Stillman College, a historically Black college in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, his alma mater. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Anderson.
Am I ready to go now?
You are ready, sir.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. Like all of us, I wish I could be in Charleston in person for a lot of reasons, but until then, Zoom will do. These are three of my favorite quotes that I think are appropriate to our nation. My favorite one, of course, is Maya Angelou, and I'm always telling my students that we have a difficult past to face. You know, when we think about 2.5 centuries of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, and the way some of our fellow Americans treated the others, as well as colonialism and the treatment of indigenous people, we should always realize that aside from the glory that we share, we also have a difficult past to face. And I was struck by Maya Angelou when she reminds us that however difficult it is, it cannot be unlived. And that our task, our challenge is to face it with courage so that it would never be lived again. The late Eugene Genovese is a quote that I like, and what he says, until a people can and will face their own past, it has no future. And then the Nobel laureate William Faulkner, I'm always reminded of that when he says the past is never dead, it's not even past, because much of what we deal with today echoes with the tensions and conflicts and challenges of the past. And so I'm very pleased to join this and speak about the history of African American education in that vein. Next slide. So this presentation on the history of African American education focused mainly on 3 phases of the Black education experience. And I want to look at war and emancipation, roughly from 1860 to 1868, the important area of military reconstruction that I think requires a revisiting by all American scholars as well as American public, because it's been so misconstrued, as we will hope we will see. And then the separate and unequal up until around post-World War II. But it is critical to understand the enslaved experience as it's during this period that African Americans cultivated and transmitted from generation to generation distinctive beliefs about literacy and freedom. And it's only with an understanding of that experience, can we make sense of what followed? I remember talking to the late historian Herbert Gutman, who wrote a wonderful book on the Black family and slavery and freedom. And he had intended to write a book on Reconstruction. But as he observed the behavior of African Americans across so many communities and across all of the southern states, it did make sense in terms of the historiography on slavery. So actually, instead of doing a book on Reconstruction, he went back to try to understand what was it about the experiences of enslaved African American and free persons of color that actually made sense of what they did upon emancipation. And I think what we will eventually learn, and what we don't know as much about as we should, is that on the eve of the American Revolution, nearly 3/4 of all African Americans in the British colonies lived in the Chesapeake and Low Country region. This regional concentration provided structural support for the creation of a distinctive African American culture and the intergenerational transmission of patterns of meaning and shared values within the constraints of a dominant slaveholders regime. The folklorist Roger Abrams characterized this subterranean process as two cultures living, quote, cheek to jowl for a matter of centuries, entertaining each other, subtly imitate each other in selective ways, but never fully comprehending the extent and meaning of these differences. And I think the latter part is important to understand, because not even people who live very closely to free persons of color and enslaved people, even in the same cities and on the same plantation, did not fully comprehend their culture and their values. With respect to the African Americans, over the centuries within shared spaces, they accumulated new historical experiences in which they transformed into cultural practices, institutional arrangement, and alternative belief systems, through which they interpreted, arranged, and hammered out the meaning of education for their communities, even as they interacted with power holders, imposing severe constraints upon them. Hence, it should come as no surprise that they emerged from slavery with a distinctive consciousness of literacy and long-standing conceptual models in which dominant values of literacy were borrowed, redefined, and transmuted into their own ideas of both education and civil society. Next slide, please. Early literacy among free persons of color. Within the walls of dominance and subordination, African Americans created and recreated a distinctive and resilient value system of education and civic reasoning. African American values of literacy and education were formed within formal systems of education, but mostly in the campaigns for literacy by both free persons of color and enslaved African Americans, and subterranean movements passed on from generation to generation. Formal education, all historians, it's a consensus among historians that formal education for African Americans in what is now the United States of America began with the creation of the first known school for African Americans, established as Goose Creek Parish in Charleston, South Carolina in 1695. This small beginning of efforts to make enslaved persons literate expanded during the middle of the 18th century. During the 1740s, believing literacy to be a prerequisite for baptism, the Society for the Propagation of Gospel trained slaves and free persons of color in Christian principles and literacy in Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. Colonies that contained about 90% of slaves in British America during the mid-18th century. A school for enslaved persons was opened in South Carolina in 1743, and by 1747 had graduated 40 students. By 1755, 70 African-American children were enrolled in the South Carolina school. Literate slaves were to be sure a small minority of the whole. Slaves, as well as free persons of color who could read and write, numbered in the tens of hundreds, while the slave population of Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina numbered in the tens of thousands. Still, historians of slave literacy estimate that by 1800, approximately 10% of slaves acquired the ability to read and write on a basic level. Next slide. As early as 1740, South Carolina, responding to literacy movements among free persons of color and slaves, enacted a law prohibiting any person from teaching or causing a slave to be taught to read or write. In 1770, Georgia enacted similar legislation, and other southern states would be soon to follow. Restrictions against African American literacy grew worse over time. Local ordinances supplemented state laws. In some places, it became a crime merely to sell reading materials to slaves. Following reactions to slave revolts led by Grable Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, and the Nat Turner Revolt in 1830, completed the reactionary course throughout the Lower South and even influenced the Upper South as well. Georgia in 1829 provided fines, whipping, or imprisonment for anyone teaching enslaved people to read and write. Louisiana and North Carolina followed with anti-literacy laws in 1830, stating that literacy tended to excite dissatisfaction and produce insurrectionary attitudes in the minds of the slaves. In its 1830-31 legislative session, Virginia provided penalties for teaching slaves to read or write. Alabama's harsh legislation grew directly out of the post-insurrectionary panic of 1831-1832. South Carolina, revising its 1740 ban on slave literacy, passed in 1834 the most sweeping law against teaching enslaved and free persons of color to read or write. Next slide, please. Although the powerful opposition of slaveholders to slave literacy succeeded in keeping the vast majority of African Americans illiterate, it did not prevent the forging of a literate leadership that was extremely important to the second phase of the Black education experience, the campaign for self-sustaining systems of education during the Civil War and the immediate emancipation period. Many African American education leaders during the war and emancipation period were former slaves and free persons of color who first became literate under the restrictions of a dominant slave regime. Their ideas about the value and purpose of literacy and formal schooling took shape during the slave experience and reflected a consciousness of literacy as a means of resistance, as well as anti-literacy movements as mechanisms of oppression. They tended to view literacy and formal education as means to liberation and freedom, and their frames of reference sparked the drive for native schools and Sabbath schools during emancipation. Native schools, as they were labeled by the Freedmen's Bureau Superintendent of Schools, John Albert, sprung up across the South during the war and exploded upon emancipation. In South Carolina, for example, in 1867, African Americans in Camden, South Carolina, established 22 schools in which more than 4,000 children were instructed. Native schools also expanded in Sumter and Marion, Darlington, Simmondsville, Florence, Chateau, and Bennettsville, and Timmonsville. African Americans contribute their money, land, and labor to make native schools possible, and they organized responsible committees to supervise the schools. And I also point to what happened across the South. By 1867, 2 years after the abolition of slavery, Alford estimated that the South had at least 500 self-sustaining Black schools, which he called native schools. And he made a conservative estimate that in native schools, 500,000 of these poor people, as he called them, are now studying the spelling book or advanced readers, including the New Testament. And of course, he was referring to ordinary people. Upon emancipation, next slide, please. Okay, this is the next slide. It became readily apparent that former slave population emerged from the peculiar institution with a vision of citizenship that included a civic commitment to universal education. The underlying foundation of their social and political movement for universal education rested on their deep sense of self-reliance, self-determination, and their newly acquired citizenship, specifically the power to vote and shape the politics of the postbellum South. In addition to free schools or native schools, there were also a system built by the free people that the Freedmen's Bureau referred to as Sabbath schools, or Sabbath school system throughout the South. By 1869, the Freedmen's Bureau offered a conservative estimate of over 1,500 Sabbath schools enrolling 107,000 students. Such schools were established and paid for and sustained by Black churches as part and parcel of their self-reliant movement to provide for the education of their children. And also point to an example in Little Rock, Arkansas, because it was more than just the native schools and Sabbath schools that were established primarily for African Americans. Early on, African Americans began to think about a free school system that would involve all of the children, including the white children as well. So in Little Rock, Arkansas, formerly enslaved people, in addition to establish schools for their children, formed the Freedmen's School Society in March of 1865 with the primary purpose of collecting monies for free schools. By their own exertions, reported John Eatman of the Freedmen's Bureau, African Americans made the city schools free for the rest of the year. To the best of his knowledge, Eden estimated that these were the first free schools in Arkansas, whether for whites or blacks, to subscribe and pay in full the compensation of the teachers. So one of the first free school systems for all of the children in the South developed in 1865 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Developments in Louisiana and elsewhere demonstrate that the native school movement was shouldered by ordinary men and women, even as it relied on the more educated elite for its teachers and administrators. In New Orleans, the Freedmen's Bureau got off to a great start by establishing the Board of Education in 1864 that operated 95 schools. By 1866, however, in order to reduce the financial cost to the Bureau, its officials temporarily closed all Black schools under their authorization, and the general tax for freedmen's education was suspended by military order. The closing of the schools and the suspension of the tax came as a shock to the freed people. The superintendent of freedmen's schools, John Alford, recorded the response by the formerly enslaved. They could not consent to have their children sent away from study, and at once expressed willingness to be assessed for the whole expense. The freed people petitioned to the Union military officers to levy an added tax upon their community to replenish the Bureau's school fund. Petitions demanding the continuation of free schools poured in from all over Louisiana. As Albert recorded, I saw one petition from plantations across the river, at least 30 feet in length, represent 10,000 Negroes. It was affecting to examine it and note the names and marks of such a long list of parents, ignorant themselves, but begging that their children might be educated, promising that from beneath their present burdens and out of their extreme poverty, they would pay for it. And this is just one example of what happened across the South in terms of the commitment that African Americans have made to educate their children. Now, the most important phase, and the phase that is often overlooked, is military reconstruction. And that is the most critical phase in African American education, not only in the 19th century, but I think it's probably the most critical phase that we're seeing in the whole history of African American education. Next slide, please. Military reconstruction was important. Under the Military Reconstruction Acts passed in 1867, Congress empowered its occupying armies to register all eligible voters and call for new state constitutional conventions. Consequently, the former Confederate states witnessed for the first time the massive registration of Black voters, as well as their critical participation in reshaping Southern constitutions. Of the approximately 630,000 whites and 750,000 freed people that registered in 10 former Confederate states, newly registered Black voters comprised a majority in South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and Alabama. The South immediately saw a new and different vision of democratic education inserted into the Southern constitutions of 1868. South Carolina witnessed a total registration of 127,000, of which 80,000 or more, or 63%, were African American. More important, their newfound political power, the freed people set on the course to build a system of free and equal public education. Although they did not accomplish all they envisioned, they effectively changed the course of Southern education from Reconstruction until the end of the 19th century and beyond. Next slide, please. So this was the second great reform movement in the South. And it was a conversion of post-war education reform, a conversion of power that made post-war reform movements possible. But chief among them was the acquisition of citizenship and the voter registration under the Reconstruction Acts. As long as African Americans participated as voters and office holders in Southern states and local governments, their social and educational interests could not be easily ignored. In 1870, African Americans constituted the majority of total population in the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. They made up more than 40% of the state populations in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and Virginia, backed by the reality that even greater potential of a powerful voting bloc in Southern politics. Educational opportunities for Black children fared well from the moment of enfranchisement during the Reconstruction to the period of disfranchisement in the late 19th century. Next slide, please. Now, just to look at the education provision in the Constitution in South Carolina from its Constitutional Convention and resultant state constitution in 1868. Francis L. Cardozo, person who is well known in the history of African American education as well as in the history of South Carolina, as he also became Secretary of State and Treasurer of the state. But he chaired the convention's education committee and was a principal architect of Article 10 of the 1868 South Carolina State Convention. And I'll just go through some of its sections. One, it established free schools for the first time in the history of South Carolina. It also established compulsory attendance for the first time in the history of South Carolina. And then it also made provision for a free school system that would be tax supported, because Cardozo, as well as other African Americans attending the Constitutional Convention of 1868, realized that African Americans had paid out of their pockets for the native schools as well as the settler schools, and their vision of education was free, tax supported, and democratic. They also called for the establishment of normal school for teacher training, and that also was the first. Next. They also, in the Constitution, provided for education, what was then called the blind, deaf, and dumb. Also created a school for the juvenile reform school. And another thing that they did and was incorporated into the Constitution was to call for a land-grant university. At the time, South Carolina did not have a land-grant university, because when the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, South Carolina was part of the Confederacy in war against the Union. And so it didn't apply to them. But in the 1868 Constitution, it called for a land-grant university that would eventually be established. And then in the end, Section 10 called for schools without regard to race or color. And that's important, because if you notice in all of these articles, like the land-grant university, they didn't call for two land-grant universities, but just a single land-grant university, because at the time, there were African Americans who were attending the University of South Carolina, which was the state liberal arts college, and there were African Americans like Richard Greener that was teaching at the University of South Carolina and went on to get his law degree while he was an instructor at the University of South Carolina. So what they envisioned in the 1868 Constitution was a single school system without regard to race or color, and therefore there's nothing in there that calls for separate institutions. That stands in marked contrast to the 1868, go back to the other slide for just a second. In the 1868, once the Democratic Party regained control of the state, and they made it very clear that there would be separate schools for children of white and colored races, and no child of either race shall ever be permitted to attend school provided for children of other race. Okay, next slide. Now, one thing that's important that I want to get at is because when people think about Reconstruction, they think about it as a time for governments breaking down. They often charge that there was corruption, and people, even the most kind, I would say, historians view Reconstruction as a failure. Well, it was not a failure. I had noticed that Horace Mann Bond, who was a historian of African American education, and also that there was relatively equality in schools for Blacks and whites from the Reconstruction period to the end of the 19th century, around 1900. And this was significant, not only for Alabama, as he was writing about at the time, but he said it was a pattern throughout the South. And that was a pattern that was held across the southern states. So I wanted to test that. Next slide. So what I decided to do, and actually using some counties where I grew up in the Black Belt of Alabama, because it just seemed counterintuitive that we would think that African Americans would have a system of education equal to that of whites in the 19th century. People then tend to think of the equality movements as post-Brown. Well, I decided to test that on a number of things. First, looking at the populations. Next slide. Now, I thought there were measures of things like enrollment. I wanted to see what did that look like, because one of the things we know that happened in the Jim Crow era is that African-American students did not attend school at a rate even close to that of whites. But in 1877, you can see that in many cases, the enrollment of African Americans is equal to or greater than the enrollment of whites in these counties. And the same thing was there in 1887. It began to change in 1897 when the southern states regained control and then instituted new constitutions. And then what happened as a consequence of the racially segregated constitution, by 1915, the gaps had widened to an extensive point. And so by that time, you could see that the percent of white students enrolled in schools almost double, in some cases triple the number of Black students enrolled. That was not true in 1877 or 1887 or 1897. Next slide, please. The other thing I want to measure, because from Lewis Holland's Separate and Unequal, people talked about how short the school terms for African Americans were under Jim Crow. So I wanted to know, under the constitutions that were established by African Americans and the coalitions of Republicans and Southern whites in the 1868, if that made a difference in terms of the length of public school days for African Americans. And you can see that in 1877, in many cases, the school days for African Americans outnumbered the school days for white children. And you look at the bottom, African Americans ended up with a +2. In 1887, it was +16. In 1897, even as Democrats regained control and established new constitutions and new rules for education, African American students were only behind by 2 days in terms of the length of the public schools in a given year. If you go to 1915, that had changed dramatically. They were behind 54 days. And this was a consequence of the Jim Crow constitutions that were created in the late 1890s and of course implemented in the early part of the 20th century. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, this one. Other thing I wanted to look at was the pay for teachers, because one of the things that happened in Separate Unequal, that African American teachers suffered greatly with less pay than white teachers. And there were Supreme Court cases and federal court cases around the unequal pay for teachers in the 20th century. So I wanted to know, okay, what happened in the 19th century? Well, you can see that in 1877, in most cases, African American teachers are getting paid more than white teachers. And by 1887, those trends continue. If you move to the far right, in 1915, you can see that the pay for white teachers doubled and triples the pay for Black teachers, again, after the Democrats regained control of the southern states and established a new separate but equal constitutions. And equal was, should always be taken in quotes. Thank you. Next slide. And so with the establishment of the new constitutions under the new Democratic administrations in the late 1890s, we moved from a trend of relative equality to a trend that is down from equality. South Carolina Constitution of 1895 gave local school boards the power to discriminate in allocating the school funds between Black and white students. Alabama changed the school laws in 1890 and substituted for the Reconstruction mandate of equality in school funding, one that allowed common school funds to be spent by local school boards as they saw fit. The Jim Crow South inverted the Reconstruction mandate of racially equal schooling and inserted in its place the theory that the state should pledge itself to the education of white children, even if this meant diverting to the schools that portion of the school funds paid by African Americans. The obvious corollary of this theory was that Black Southerners, despite being taxed for public education, would have to find other means to provide universal schooling for their children, or as many white Southerners preferred, that they would have no schooling at all. The emergence of Jim Crow schooling meant that while taxes paid by African Americans were diverted to firm up support for white schools, schools for Black children were forced to rely on private philanthropy and what Du Bois called double taxation, the practice of paying for Black schools through voluntary contributions of land, labor, and money. For example, according to a 1938 school survey and school plant inventory, of the 2,407 school buildings for Black children in Alabama, 730, or only 30%, were actually publicly owned. The rest, 70%, were privately owned. Next slide. Other Southern states followed a similar pattern. And I won't go over each detail of this, but I just want to say that the way African-American communities were able to cope with the gross discrimination of the Jim Crow constitutions, as well as the state and local implementation of school funding, was to build a system of schooling out of their own pockets. And so what happened in what is known as the Rosenwald School, that between 1914 and 1927, that African Americans raised more than $3.5 million to help build schools for their kids in the absence of public support. Next slide. So when the Rosenwald School program began in 1914, African Americans were really behind in school attendance. And over the course of about a 20-25 year period, they actually closed the gap. And I should point out, and it's important to emphasize, that in the building of the Rosenwald schools, African Americans contribute more money than the Rosenwald Foundation. And by the 1930s, 90% of African American kids, the younger kids, aged 5 to 14, were attending schools, compared to 91% for white children. And what this meant was, in one generation, the elementary school attendance of young Black children increased from 36% to 90%. And this critical transformation rested squarely on the culture and the economic means of ordinary African-American men and women. So they found money in church rallies and all kinds of ways to pay for schools, because the state would not provide public schools for African-American children. Next. So I will try to sum up what happened at the secondary level. It was difficult enough to provide elementary schools, and of course they managed to do that with the Rosenwald School campaign. But at the high school level, it was such gross inequality that I think even today the nation does not realize the ways in which African-American students were so displaced and disadvantaged when it came to high schools. And I go to the bottom part of it, that on the eve of World War II, 77% of Black high school age population was not even enrolled in public secondary schools. The condition was even more dramatic in states with the largest proportion of African Americans. In Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Louisiana, more than 80% of the Black high school age populations were not enrolled in public secondary schools in 1940. More than 90% of Mississippi's Black high school age population was not enrolled in public schools at that time. This condition of secondary education limited the use of the GI Bill, by the way, because African Americans were not provided a high school education. They did not have high school diplomas, and even those who served in World War II could not really take advantage of the GI Bill, at least with respect to going to college. They could usually go to trade schools, but not to college. Next slide, please. Now, what is important to know about the history of African American education is that by 1948, enrollment trends were again increasing, but more than 2/3 of the generation of 1950 was not enrolled in public high schools. And what we know now, and this is really my generation, it was not until the 1960s that Southern states made secondary education universal for African American students. And the great increase was not a movement to bring about equality, but was a response to the Brown decision and was part of a massive resistance. So many Southern states thought that if they could equalize the high schools for African American kids, that somehow this could allay the implementation of Brown v. Board of Education. So it was almost like a bribe. We will build you a better high school if you don't persist in school desegregation. And it tells us a lot about how African American students fell behind, because some people look at culture, some people look at values, some people look at study habits, they look at a lot of things. What they don't look at is that, and this came from from the late comedian Red Fox, who said there was only one thing that kept him from going to college, and that was high school. Well, that was true across the South for African American students. High schools were not provided. And so for many families and students, unless you lived in cities like Richmond or Charleston or Birmingham, and about 70% of African American students lived in rural areas. So they didn't have high schools. And therefore, universal secondary education didn't come to the African American community as a whole until the 1960s. I think I've gone over by 4 or 5 minutes, so I will stop here.
How much more time do you need, Dr. Anderson?
I finised.
No, I mean, if you have a few more minutes, that's fine. We can make adjustments.
I think I'll just stop here. You said it will be question and answers?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think I'll stop here then. And okay. I can elaborate on some things if the questions prompt me.
Okay. So we will begin taking questions from the audience. Tina, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready to go. Okay, Dr. Anderson, here is your first question from Kristen French. It appears that Black students did not change their enrollment over the period you described. The gap in Black-white attendance seems to be caused by more and more white students attending school. Why do you think that is? Specifically thinking of the changes from mid-1860s to 1915.
Well, what happened is that that from the 1860s, roughly to the end of the 19th century, let's say 1900, the constitutions that African Americans established in the Reconstruction era were still in play. Those constitutions didn't change until the late 1890s. So for an instance, in Alabama, the Constitution says specifically that the school tax fund must be divided equally among students and without regard to race or color. And so therefore, the tax fund was used to build schools for African American kids, and that accounted for their attendance being pretty much the same as white students. Beyond the 1890s, particularly into the early 20th century, 1915, the states had begun to take money away from African American schools, to shut down African American schools. For instance, there were many places. I know in Mississippi, for instance, the governor shut down the normal school. So you saw a pattern of southern states literally shutting down public opportunities for African Americans to go to school. And so what you see in the public records is a gross gap in terms of attendance. It doesn't account for African Americans who are going to private schools that are supported by Black churches, by Black communities, and private organizations. But this is just an account of what's happening in the public schools.
Thank you very much. This next question is from Carol Fishman. I read somewhere that South Carolina had virtually no commitment to public education, white or Black, until the establishment of mill schools connected to the textile mill towns. Could you talk about this if true?
No, actually, South Carolina became committed to a tax-supported free system of public education with this Constitution of 1868. That was, and it's Article 10 of the 1868 Constitution that was actually framed by Francis Cardozo, introduced into the state the establishment of free public schools, tax-supported public schools.
Thank you. This next question is from Dr. Kayla Goodwine. Please provide any history of constituent boards in CCSD, Charleston County School District. Why were constituent boards created? From my understanding, CCSD is the only district in the US with constituent boards. Please provide any insight on constituent boards.
I don't know why constituent boards were created in Charleston. I do know that there were things that were peculiar about education in Charleston up until the 1920s or so, because as far as I know, it's the only city in the South that did not allow African-American teachers to teach in the public schools for African-American kids. Only white teachers for about a 20-year period. And so South Carolina gets off to a very different history from 1868 to the end of the 19th century. And then all of a sudden it develops a system in which white teachers are teaching even in the African-American schools, and African-American teachers are barred from teaching. I don't know if that had anything to do with constituent school boards, but it was a very strange kind of dual school system where it had separate schools for Black children and white children, but even in the schools for Black children, there were only white teachers.
Thank you. Does anyone, that was the last question that we have. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask Dr. Anderson? Please type it in the Q&A.
Well, there is one I'd like to respond to.
Sure.
In the QA, it has to do with discussions about reparations for African Americans.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay.
Well, it's more than just slavery, by the way, because in education, what we now know, and we just take the Rosenwald schools, for instance, in order to get a Rosenwald school, even though African Americans were paying for it with their money out of their pockets in a very cash-short economy that they lived in order to get a Rosenwald school, African Americans would donate the land. Someone with land would donate for the school. They would then pay that money for it. But in order to get it, you had to deed it over to the state as a public school. So they were in effect paying for a public school out of their own pockets, using their own land, and upkeeping these schools with a lot of labor and money over the years. But it all went to the state. And so the state took advantage of not offering public schools for African-American kids by taking money and land from African-American communities in order to maintain schools. This is part of reparations. It's part of paying people back for what you took from them beyond slavery. So some people think that this use of labor and the fact that African-Americans were not paid during slavery is the essence of reparations. It's not. And another thing I'd like to add about reparations, and I was going through the congressional record studying the passage of the 14th Amendment and discovered that the first request for reparations came not from African Americans, it came from Southern slaveholders to the US Congress. They asked the Congress to repay them for the emancipation of African Americans and the amount of money they had lost due to the end of slavery or the abolition of slavery. And so it was actually white Southerners who put a request forward for reparations for slavery. And I just think that is so ironic in so many ways.
Thank you. Any other questions? You can enter either in the chat or the Q&A box, and Dr. Anderson is happy to answer. Okay, we have one coming in. This is from Dondi. Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, you have a question from Crystal Rouse. During Reconstruction, how was public education structured around the time of year and sharecropping during this time?
That's an interesting one. And you have to go from state to state. There's a very, very excellent question. In South Carolina, they call for a 6-month school term, and that's in the Constitution of 1868. Now, you have to look at the crops from different states. In South Carolina, rice was a staple crop. In North Carolina, tobacco was a staple crop. In Alabama, cotton is a staple crop. And one of the things I noticed, even though it wasn't in the Constitution, that when I looked at school attendance for African-American students in North Carolina, they had the highest rates of school attendance of any state in the Union. And then I was looking at the enrollment books kept by teachers and would notice that there was above 90% school attendance from the beginning of the school year in September all the way to a month in spring, in which attendance would drop to almost zero, 10% or so. And then the next month, it went back to 90%. And I couldn't figure out why would students leave schools. And finally, I realized that that was consistent with the tobacco crop. And that at that point, they left school to put the tobacco crop in, and then they could go back to school. before it was time to harvest. Now, cotton is different. Cotton comes early in the spring through the summer, and then the harvest goes into late fall, into November. So a lot of African Americans living in the cotton economy, even though their Constitution might have called for a 6-month school year, in practice, they were kept out of school according to that crop. And of course, the sugarcane in Louisiana. And so it's interesting to look at crop rotation and how that impacted the school terms for African Americans. I do know that the South Carolina Constitution did call for a 6-month school term, and that was implemented, and it was state law, and people abided by that until that Constitution was changed in 1895.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And we have another question from Dondi Costin. How does the history of K-12 education in South Carolina impact the current state of education here?
Well, I think my view of South Carolina and the rest of the South is that once the commitment to a democratic education and a free public school system without regard to race or color in the late 1890s, and the Jim Crow system set in, and states started to literally defund Black education. And what I would always, my interpretation, actually my conclusion is that when you have states like southern states, in South Carolina, where you had a Black majority of the population for a very long time, coming out of the Civil War with a 57% majority, a majority in Louisiana, a majority in Mississippi, 48, 49 in Florida, that when you disenfranchise and defund schooling for that segment of your population, you're committing yourself to something other than a public school system, because you cannot disenfranchise and defund the majority or near majority without affecting the whole attitude about the funding of public education. So the South for a very long time suffered from its negative views of public education as a free tax-supported system without regard to race or color. And it was interesting to me that in our present, that all of the educational governors, known as educational governors, came from the South. It was Raleigh from South Carolina, Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, Clinton from Arkansas, Bush from Texas. They kept calling them the education governors. And I wonder, well, why would they be the education governors? Why not Illinois? Why not California? Why not New York? It's because education had lagged so far behind in the South due to Jim Crow and the defunding after the Reconstruction Constitution were replaced, that the South became a place that was regressive in terms of public education. And so those governors were trying to make up the lost time and the way the South had lagged behind the rest of the nation. And that continues to impact education in the South. It's difficult to make up for over 100 years of lagging behind. The cost is great, the commitment is great, and so it continues to, as William Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it's not even the past, it is indeed the present.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson, and thank you to everyone who asked questions.
Okay, everyone, we will now transition to Dr. Brown. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. I was trying to take notes very feverishly. It's so much great information that I definitely want to go back and review. We will have a recording of today's session that will be released to those that registered, and we will move forward in our program. Thank you all so much. So Dr. Millicent Brown specializes in ongoing analysis of the modern civil rights movement and explores social justice dynamics and intersections of race, gender, and class in contemporary society. Dr. Brown was one of the first Black children to integrate South Carolina schools through the case Millicent Brown versus School District 20 in Charleston, South Carolina in 1963, which was a landmark case for school desegregation in the state. She's a retired senior research fellow and associate professor of history in the Department of History and Sociology at Claflin University. I saw some Claflin folks on today. She also serves as principal investigator for the Somebody Had to Do It project, which identifies the first children, like herself, to desegregate previously all-white schools. She serves as a consultant for numerous museums, historic sites, and social justice programs, including the College of Charleston Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the South Carolina Department of Education through the Education Oversight Committee, and the historic Penn Center. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in history from the College of Charleston, a Master's of Education from the Citadel, and a PhD in 20th century US history from Florida State University. But she credits a transformative year as a PhD student at Howard University for cementing her academic achievement to issues of race, gender, and class struggle. She is intent upon correcting many of the misconceptions surrounding school desegregation, providing a more thoughtful platform for analysis of the effects of the 1954 Brown decision, and involving present-day students and faculty, especially at HBCUs, in appreciating connections between the school desegregation process and the current crisis in Black education. Dr. Brown credits having been born into an activist household during the height of the civil rights movement for her lifelong commitment to progressive social change, supplemented by her years of community service as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I present to you Dr. Millicent Brown.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here with you. And really want to express that my joy in being a part of this kind of a forum. First of all, you just learn so much. And I think we're all just kind of struck by the magnificent presentation that Dr. Anderson just gave us. But I find that the more I am involved in these kinds of conversations, I have to be honest with you, my tone over the years is changing. I'm going to begin my comments today with sharing with the audience that I don't just want to talk about these issues as much as we all love history and want to know more things. But I've begun to realize that piling good basic facts, piling them up on top of lies is very problematic. You know, we have excellent scholarship being done by the likes of Dr. Anderson and Courtney Howard and so many other people throughout the state. And information over the years just doesn't seem to push the platform. It doesn't seem to get rid of systemic racism. It's just more good information. And I find that troubling, and I address it specifically because I think that's part of what our challenge is. How do we know so much, but does it appear to not really push anything forward? And so I find myself very consciously saying, as I look back over historical fact and documentation, some of which is based on my own life experiences, I'm looking for the lies. You know, I'm looking for the mistakes, maybe innocently made. I'm looking for the stuff that's been left out and misinterpreted, maybe even by design. But I just find myself going into these discussions wanting to say, come on, folks, information is available and has been available. Scholars have been collecting this kind of information. If we want to go back to W.B. Du Bois with his history of Black Reconstruction and all the many other scholars since then. And so it is just important, I think, that we say that we know that documentation exists. The question is, will we challenge the foundation on which that documentation rests, which usually has some more sinister purposes, which we'll get into as we go on. I often have had to, even in talking with educators and those of you who know me in this, who are listening in today, I start with saying that let's make sure that even locally within South Carolina, within the Charleston region, do we take the time to get some specifics and get it right? I can't tell you how many times over the years, even locally, I've been told, oh yeah, we know about your role with Brown. And people are confusing me with Linda Brown and Topeka, Kansas, because they've heard of the Brown decision. And so when they hear about Brown versus Charleston County School Board District 20, assumptions get made and often aren't corrected. And so I go on record as saying that I think that's a challenge we have, that when people make those kinds of seeming innocent kinds of mistakes, stop them, clarify it. You know, Brown versus Board of Ed, 1954, is very different from the cases that ensued, and certainly Brown et al. Versus Charleston County School Board District, which did not get ruled until 1963. The very brief history for some in the audience who don't know is that immediately after the Brown case was decided by the Supreme Court in 54, local parents throughout the state, not just in Charleston, started filing transfer requests. Because the NAACP was so active in education in South Carolina, a lot of those requests were handled through that organization. And my sister, Minerva King, was one of the earliest plaintiffs that tried to help Charleston follow through with what Topeka, Kansas case had actually decided. So without going through the courts, requests for transfer. In her case, she was a Burke High School student trying to go to Charleston High, and she was joined by other petitioners. Those students came and went, some changed their minds, some graduated, but I just wanted to be recognized that following the Supreme Court decision of 54, there were many efforts made throughout the state to simply have South Carolina comply. So much of what Dr. Anderson has shared with us earlier, talking about the history of rejecting Black attempts at education, didn't end certainly with the beginning of the 20th century. We're now at mid-20th century, post-Brown, and we're finding that South Carolina basically said, you're not going to make us do anything. And so my sister and those first dozen or so plaintiffs ended up trying to go through the courts, being ignored, such that she graduated from high school, and a ploy was put in place that South Carolina schools and courts appealed to, and certainly the Charleston local school district appealed to. And that was to say, she, the main plaintiff, graduated, the case is moot. Now you have to start over. Now you've already tried every legal means possible. You've put in for applications to transfer to schools. And this is happening around the state, not just in Charleston. And what would essentially happen is, because the specific plaintiff was no longer present, had either changed their mind or had, as I said, graduated like my sister did, then the response was, you have to start with a new plaintiff, and that just made the process continue. My father, who was very active with NAACP in the state, and some of the other parents very quickly got guidance from the national office, and there were legal challenges made to that practice of making people start over. And so my father went down to the courthouse, and with some aid that literally I to this day do not know who the person is that helped, but changed Minerva Brown's name and inserted Millicent Brown. And therefore, in the 7th grade, I became the chief plaintiff in this case that had been attempted for so many years. I like to take time to explain that to people to make this bigger point. South Carolina took 9 years to comply with Brown versus Board of Ed 1954 decision. I think it important to remind ourselves, especially those of us who are involved in education advocacy today, that that is an example that well into the modern era, the state said, we're not going to play by the rules and we're going to do it our way. I find it interesting that one of the last questions that was raised has to do with the idea of funding. The fact that in anticipation of Brown being decided, and in the ensuing years of South Carolina's resistance to that Brown case, a lot of other activities were going on politically. A tax was imposed to build schools, as Dr. Anderson was referring to, equalization schools that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And so this tax was an attempt to avoid desegregation for sure by providing very late some kinds of semi-quality schools and institutions around the state for Black students who, in many cases, could not get beyond 8th grade. There were no high schools. Well, it is interesting, and I would ask all of you to look into some of the records to show that the response from the white community was that, well, if things are equal, that tax needs to be shared equally. And so the tax that was put in place primarily to provide Black education got divided and shared. And so that white schools got to benefit from even that source of revenue. Again, my point is that all of us, especially within South Carolina, just need to understand the importance of not only knowing the history, but making sure we understand that it speaks to the devil that we are confronting. And that is a prolonged resistance, not only to change, not only to desegregation, but to being told what to do by the federal government And just like during post-Reconstruction, we have to understand that these are the kinds of attitudes that are slowing us down and confusing and confounding much of the modern work that we want to see done. And so many of our efforts for change have to go up against what is actually not only just a political barrier, but a psychological one as well. I also want to just remind folks that even in my time frame, and I know I'm getting old now, but the fact that mid 20th century is when I and my peers are trying to be a part of this change. We not only were deferred for so many years, but when the decisions were made, from the very beginning, there were court cases throughout South Carolina simultaneous with the Millicent Brown et al. Case here in Charleston. People were lined up in Columbia, Rock Hill, Greenville, Orangeburg, Beaufort. People were ready and students were ready to go into those schools. The year that the decision was made, 1963, the Charleston case was singled out, and Judge Martin ruled that only the chief plaintiffs in the Charleston case would be allowed to desegregate in 1963, which the 9 of us did, scattered throughout Charleston, various schools, various grades, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the idea was that it was felt to be too disruptive. So, in fact, in 1963, only the Charleston schools were ordered to comply. And so we find that in 63, the Charleston group goes in 64, some of the other cities then start experiencing, but 65, 68, 1970, we find that there are still schools in South Carolina that are having their first experiences with school desegregation. Again, my point is we have got to be honest and confront what that kind of hostility and dragging really represents in terms of resistance to whatever perceived fears people had about what school desegregation would really mean. In talking about the experiences here in Charleston, I think, and in our case, it's always important that we ask ourselves to think beyond just the superficial. I get a lot of attention because obviously, as chief plaintiff in that case, people look to me and I always say, folks, are there no concerns or questions about Ovita Glover and the 3 Ford girls and Ralph Dawson, and who went to Charleston High, and Clarice Hines, and there were others. I was one of a group of 11. And so not trying to be falsely modest, but I am saying I've often wondered where the curiosity is, what about the experiences that happen to all these other students, not just me? It is important to know that we were of various ages. Most of those original plaintiffs went into elementary schools. Jackie and I went to Rivers High School. Jacqueline Ford and I went to Rivers High School. She was in the 8th grade. I was by then in the 10th. Ralph Dawson went to Charleston High by himself, and he was a senior. And the rest of the plaintiffs were at James Simmons and Mitchell, and they were in first grade, second grade, third grade, which raises one of the major issues that I usually address when talking about those experiences. Have we ever stopped to really understand what that means, that on the shoulders or the backs of basically children, almost babies, we were asking society to make this tremendous shift in attitudes on race, but it was going to be done through children at some of the most vulnerable points in their childhood development. And so from the very beginning, even though my training is in US history, particularly civil rights history, and my emphasis over the years has been on what happened in the civil rights years, when it comes to education, I have really been quite frustrated that the school desegregation process seems to have been claimed as a civil rights battle. It's talked about by historians and political scientists. And we talk about school deseg almost in the same vein as going to a movie theater or sitting in at a lunch counter, which has to do with public access. And I have over the years realized that I have a lot of frustration with that. And I thank my political science and my historian colleagues for the work that they've done in crafting a picture of civil rights activism. But I ask of our social scientists, our psychologists, our behavioral people, our counselors even, what have we been asking about the psychological dimensions of young people being asked to literally represent the race? I know that I and my colleagues and peers felt it deeply, because we were not just going in as individuals. We were supposed to go in there and prove to white people that Black folks were equal, that we were able, that we could stand toe-to-toe with them in the classrooms. And we were supposed to do this regardless of the resistance, regardless of the negativity and the marginalization that we went through. We were there in a political role. And so I am very, very interested in, as we talk about more honest dialogue and more approaches to public education, that we've got to remember we're talking about children. I was looking, and if you would maybe just put up that first slide that I shared with you. I was looking at some of the work that's been written about this through the eyes of some of the early deseg pioneers, and a book that some of you may very well be familiar with, Warriors Don't Cry. It was written by Melba Patilla Beals about her 1957 experiences as one of the first children in Little Rock, Arkansas. But the book wasn't written until 1994, when then Dr. Melba Beals decided to write her memoir. And then a few years later, in a book called Children of the Dream, I wrote my first essay, a very short essay, talking about some of my earliest recollections at Rivers High School. It was my first attempt. This was after I had a doctorate degree, but I finally, through this compilation, was able to be a part of the witness of what children were going through in their roles in school DSEG. That book was not written, I think, until 1999. And while there are certainly other works that have been written, very few exist. And so we find years, decades go by, and I'm asking this question, you know, who's curious? Who's asking questions about what does it mean to be a part of trying to bring about this kind of social change? Very recently, a woman by the name of Rachel Devlin wrote, "A Girl Stands at the Door." There's a long history about this book. I participated in it as one of the girls who tells and reminisces about the DSEG experience. But Rachel Devlin was also taking an approach that I have had problems with. Her premise in this book has to do with why girls, she makes it a gender argument that so many girls were the first to desegregate the schools. And so as a white woman very interested in advancing gender issues, she takes this position about why we as females were selected. I don't necessarily agree with her analysis, although she does do some good interviews, but she's just challenged me to be even more forthright about saying, but you don't know all the background. A lot of times the boys did not join us because they already knew, the word was already out there, that they were going to get their asses whooped if they got over to those schools. And that's exactly how the word got back into the community. So the idea that boys did not participate, you know, needs to be seen in another vein as well. There was much greater fear for what kind of actual physical confrontations right here in Charleston some of those boys would have had to have faced. There's also this idea that I was a part, my sister and I, and several of the other chief plaintiffs, we were a part of this transformative process for sure, but largely because of who our parents were. Because my father was with NAACP, he was one of these people that would never ask somebody to do something with their child that he was not willing to do with his own children. And the same goes for Reverend Glover, such that his daughter, Ovita, was one of the first. The same goes for Reverend Clarence Ford, whose children, daughters, were the first to go into some of the schools. And I could go on and on. If my father had had a son at that age in the household, that boy would have been there too. And so I need to always just take some time to say there are lots of other reasons why so many other girls were there, and it was not necessarily a well thought through, planned strategy that girls would go first. I want to also say that that does not mean that because there were mainly girls, that there were not crises and all kinds of horrible incidents that happened, some of which were physical, some were not. But I think going back to my initial premise is that we need to remember that there were children who were on this front line. And I have over the years said, if thousands, literally thousands of white children were going through a phenomenon like school desegregation in the 60s on into the early 70s, I think there would have been serious longitudinal studies done. I think some of you know about the Framingham health studies done up in Massachusetts. I think about that one often, where longitudinal studies have been done by health professionals to understand the incidence of diabetes or of high blood pressure or all kinds of other things. And I've often said, where are our longitudinal studies? You know, why have there not been more inquiries as to what happens to a third grader who is marginalized, like Ovita and some of the other children were at James Simmons, when nobody wanted to jump rope with them. And some of them would not be talked to or were harassed in other ways. I had so many issues of not feeling that I, as a 10th grader, had ever been supportive enough of Jackie, who was in 8th grade. She was in the same school with me. We didn't have the same lunch period. We didn't take classes together. I sometimes saw her in the hallway, and all I could think of was, I'm older, I should be protecting her from this insanity that we're walking through, especially in the first years. So that meant I grew up with a lot of guilt. I was guilty about everything. Was I helping the other young Black kids enough? You know, was I being enough of a representative? Starting from the first day that we went to school at Rivers, and the community had been warned by the mayor that we were not going to be in Mississippi or Alabama. So we are not going to allow mobs to congregate outside these schools, where we're going to be more peaceful. And so, and I think, to the credit of the leadership at that time, we did not suffer the physical abuse that, say, a Little Rock had or what have you. But at the same time, when the bomb to be evacuated from that building, I remember the first day, I think it was 3 times, the whole school had to be evacuated. By the 3rd time, the teachers were looking at me and saying things like, you know, we can't get our work done, so we can't get on. And here I am, I'm 15 years old, and I just get consumed with guilt. You know, they can't start school because I'm here. You know, and it just reminds me, and I'm able to talk about this more freely now, but it just comes back to who did not seem to care, and over time has not invested actual psychological impact of asking people as children, as babies, to change societal attitudes. And then we kind of leave them and don't know why they either did not prosper or why they did not achieve all that they perhaps could have. There are questions that will possibly come up later, and so I'll get off that point for now. But I do want to say that I believe that actually, even locally, understanding what really happened here in Charleston County. How did it happen? Where did it happen? With whom it happened is an important part of our discovery of a way forward. The devastation that was felt throughout this time period, throughout the country, is beginning to be talked about in terms of either memoirs, like some of the books that I'm talking about. A woman who I helped when she was doing her doctoral training in North Carolina, Dr. Karen Meadows, did Pedagogy of Survival. A work that I find very humbling, because she took my experiences and compared them with those of a woman by the name of Josephine Boyd, who was in North Carolina. And so what Dr. Meadows begins to help with this historiography is really beginning to look at school deseg and segmenting it as to based on it went differently depending on where you were, what city you were. And beyond that, it went to what age, what grade, and also, of course, what gender. And so that is why when we talk about school deseg, I say to all my educator colleagues that there are multiple questions that need to be pursued. And I hope that the research will continue, because we need to understand more of a phenomenon and not just a civil rights action, because that can be compartmentalized quite differently. And I think we get different issues and questions as a result of that. Going back to what happened, and you can take that, that off the screen if you like. Going back to discussing what happened in Charleston and in South Carolina, I do thank Dr. Anderson for talking about some of the funding that was either present or not present, because a point that has to be made is still we teach desegregation of schools as Black students needing and wanting to go to school with white students. And unless we add to our analysis of why there was a need for school deseg in the first place, yes, there was first, we had to get rid of this apartheid that existed in this country, which said that because of your skin color, you are not good enough to be in school with our children. And so that obvious misthinking of white supremacy had to be challenged. And so school deseg has to be seen as an assault on white supremacy, first and foremost, okay? Secondly, we have to understand that, as I'm often told my students, that there was not a separate pot of Black taxpayers' money that went for Black schools and white taxpayers' money that went for white schools. It was all in the same pot. So school desegregation was pushed also because Black parents and community people said, we are tired of our tax money not ever being realized for our own children. I can remember coming up in a school system where, yes, we got the books after the white children had already used and abused them. And I say, it makes a difference if you don't have the last pages of a book. And so for these hand-down kinds of resources, or just lack of resources, our tax money from the Black community was not being realized. And so when we teach about school deseg, I ask people, do you please understand the importance that this is a political action that Black communities are taking to make sure that their legitimate tax money is not deprived of them and their students and their children, and to somewhat balance this idea that we want to go to school with white children. I am particularly sensitive to that fact because many years later, I would end up with my first college teaching position would be at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. It happens that my older sister actually attended Bennett, and I just, as a coincidence, got my first college teaching degree, teaching experience at Bennett. It's an all-Black school with marvelous students. And I would often try to share in my teaching of history and social and civil rights and whatever. I would try to talk about my experiences. And one day, one of these beautiful Black women comes to me and says, Dr. Brown, you talk about the all-Black schools and when you went into the previously all-white schools. She said, but to us, when you say all Black, we think ghetto. And I said, what do you mean? And she went on to share with me that her experiences, she was so young, and those of her classmates, they had grown up in schools that this emphasis on Black schools were so inferior that we had to desegregate the schools because if we didn't, Black people weren't going to be well educated. And so her whole introduction to all Black schools had been that Black meant inferior, white meant superior. I literally could not catch my breath. I had to go back, and for many years that I continued to teach at Claflin, at Hofstra, at the College of Charleston, everywhere, North Carolina A&T, everywhere that I eventually ended up teaching, I remembered that we are not telling the truth. We are not telling what Dr. Anderson said about the commitment of Black people to quality education. And in Charleston, we are continuing to deny the excellence of all Black schools because we've got this narrative about the Blacker the school, the more inferior it is. Therefore, you can't have all Black without thinking ghetto. And I am humbled by this young woman coming to me and making me aware. And I am just so wanting that you understand that that's where the enemy is, that by not knowing of the background of the Burkes, the Simontons, the Rhett schools, and C.A. Browns, whatever, you know, by not embracing the level of excellence that always existed, we are now buying into that narrative of, yes, we desegged because Black people need to sit next to white people if they're going to be smart or if they're going to be well educated. And we have got to make sure that we don't continue to spread that falsehood and understand how crippling that continues to be. Because that is why, whether we are very proud of all the successes of our middle class Black children who get into whatever schools they may go to, we have to even challenge Black parents that, you know, you're leaving a community school, in this case, let's say a Burke, because you think that you have to go to Academic Magnet or the School of the Arts, you know, and so we lose a political confrontation with, we demand that our tax dollars make sure that our children, wherever they go to school, are given the right resources to grow and develop into all that they can possibly be. That is not to suggest that desegregation is bad. It is just to remind us that we better also consider the psychological impact of trying to tell people that you can't get well educated if you don't go to school with white people. And it is something that from 1963, I have been dealing with and was confronted with when I got to Rivers and found out by day one that all white people aren't smart. I had never seen such dumbness in all my life. And it's like, I've been educated in the schools of Charleston, all Black, all this time. And I didn't know. My father is state president of the NAACP. But in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking that white people are smart just because they're white. And it was not until I got into Rivers that I realized, oh my gosh, not only am I smarter than some, and you know, I got rid of that misconception. But for so many of us, we didn't challenge it, and we don't realize that that is the message that we are sending. And while I do believe in desegregated education, I think for the sake of white, brown, Black kids, yes, this ideal idea of all of us need to go to school together to get to know each other because that's the real world, I believe in that. But I also believe that we better be careful that if we find ourselves in an all Black setting, that we don't assume then that excellence cannot prevail. And that is a part of the transparency that we are going to have to make sure that we are passing on as we confront present day concerns and neglect and this transformation that I've seen in my lifetime, and many of you have as well, where Black, which had been marginalized and segregated completely, got substituted. And so we don't talk about not wanting to go to school with Black kids anymore or brown kids. Now we talk about because of their socioeconomic. And I am reminded of a time when, you know, you could have been the child of the richest Black person in Charleston or the most economically fortunate Black people. That didn't mean that you were the smartest kid in the class, because your economic status was not the determinant of your academic future. And so Black teachers understood that. They lived with us. They were on our streets. We went to church with them. So the idea is that this notion that based on socioeconomic, we then make our determinants. We have to look at what is going on in poor communities for sure, but there is a very, very big difference between replacing race and now we talk about poor, because you're doing the same thing. You're making the same assumptions of a group and you're not analyzing what were the particular needs. I just need to make that very clear, that that was one of the things that that school DSEG started in an erroneous way, saying to people, and now we're afraid of poor folks, you know. And I am reminded that, and I will call no names, but I was reminded that I had a classmate whose father literally was a trash collector. And she was one of the smartest kids in the class. What did make a difference in neighborhoods, however, is that those of us who came from educated backgrounds, our parents were college educated or were professional people, those Black neighborhoods, segregated as they may have been, they also allowed us to share across class lines. So I have friends whose parents did not graduate high school, but who were brought into my home or on my street and some of my other friends' homes. And so we learned to appreciate intellectual prowess. And you could have been the child of a fairly well-to-do Black person, but you might have also been dumb. And you could have been the child of a uneducated person, but you had a good brain. And our teachers understood how to look through the difference and not brand us and treat us according to their perception of what they thought our ability was. I'm going to go on. You're going to have to remind me because I've lost track of time completely, Audrey. So you're going to have to let me know whether I'm almost to the end of.
We are going to pause right here, and we're going to bring Dr. Anderson. I know that we're getting close to time. We're going to keep going, and we're still recording because we want to get some of these questions answered. So let's start with, let's see. One of the things we want to talk about was, both of you have talked about kind of the role of historically Black colleges and universities. And I know there was a question from Crystal Rouse about that as well. What do you think the role is going forward in maintaining the history of our educational journey as a people and their role moving forward in the public education of students in K-12?
Good question. And I've had the opportunity to, there were two cases involving historically Black colleges and universities, particularly public ones, and one was Knight versus Alabama, which I was an expert witness in, and others as V. Fordyce. And in both cases, I wrote the history of HBCUs for the federal courts and just discovered a lot of things. I mean, in the case of Asby Fordyce, I went to a Black college, Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I knew when you go to a Black college, you know all the Black colleges. And I thought of them as our colleges. So we played them in sports, whether it was Jackson or Southern University or Alcorn or Albany State. And so during the course of the case, we were in a meeting and we were asking a lot of questions. And the attorneys for the state of Mississippi said, can we get a break? And they called all of the African-Americans from Jackson State and Mississippi Valley State and Alcorn into a room. And I happen to know them because some of them had gone to graduate school with me. So later that evening, I said, well, what happened? He said, they reminded us that we worked for the state of Mississippi. And it hit me that these public colleges, which I thought belonged to us, belonged to the states. And they could make decisions that could affect the education of African Americans in so many ways. And so, I learned that we have to be very political in protecting these colleges, and have to be very aggressive in protecting these colleges, and simply not think of them as belonging to us. I mean, I know in Mississippi, one of the proposals from the state was to close Mississippi Valley State and to close Alcorn and only leave Jackson State as a historical Black college. That was a decision the state could make, except we argued against it in the courts, and the courts sided with the plaintiffs, with the heirs plaintiffs. So that's one thing I learned. Other thing is that, going back to the question, is that the HBCUs were always important to K-12 education, because for a long time, even through the 1920s, most HBCUs had high school students.
High schools, right.
And they trained. Fisk University, for instance, had more students in the high school than they had in their collegiate program, because they realized that the southern states were not providing high schools for African American kids. And in order to have a collegiate population, they had to train their own high school students. And the other thing was that HBCUs had standards that only HBCUs could apply in the high schools that they operated. So for instance, you still had to know Latin and Greek to get into Fisk in the 1920s. Even though Harvard had already dropped it, a lot of HBCUs still had those requirements. And so they then had in the high school the kind of college prep program that would provide them with a freshman class, and also given some of the high schools in the nation. As you know, some places like the M Street High School in DC and other places, you have some good high schools in the cities. But the HBCUs are very important to K-12. And the most important thing is what Millicent has talked about. I call it our inoculation during Jim Crow. They train the Black teachers. The HBCUs train the Black teachers. And that was our gift. You know, coming out of Alabama always laughed. Elementary to high school, even through colleges, it was only African American students. But one thing that we did learn in high school, as Millicent has pointed out, we had some of the most gifted high school teachers, professional high school teachers, that gave us the kind of education that enabled us to go to college and beyond, because we had such a great foundation. So HBCUs have been very critical. When you look at the percent of African American students in teacher education programs today, we still need to rely on HBCUs to reinvigorate their programs. So where will African American teachers come from? Just look around the country and look at their percents in colleges of education, elite universities, private universities, traditionally public white universities. And we know that African American students sorely need. There was a study recently that demonstrated that if you only had one African American teacher, it made a difference in the lives of our contemporary students. If they only had just one, they need more than one. But HBCUs have always played that critical role of providing highly trained, highly professional African American teachers for the African American community.
May I add something very quickly to that? And that's because I have an aunt who for many years was at South Carolina State and was the director of the Felton Lab School. So many HBCUs had on their campuses laboratory schools. So they were not only training the teachers, but they were offering really excellent educational introduction, even at kindergarten level on through elementary school level, through their laboratory schools, which was another benefit to their local communities, you know. And so I'm just saying it's just another thing. But thank you for making that point about the threat of closure, because one of the things about desegregation, and I think the people in on this conversation are familiar with what is happening, let's say here in Charleston County, this idea that whenever there is some effort being made to consolidate, it's Black schools that are asked closed. That goes back even to the time when, I'm talking about 63, when we first did school deseg, where there was never an effort made to get white students to then go to existing Black schools at the time. DSEG was a one-way street of Black schools, Black students going into what were perceived as white arenas. And I've always thought that, you know, if they wanted to really deseg, there could have been a two-way street kind of thing. And who knows what difference that could have made. But the idea is white people got to see us as invaders of their terrain. And so something as simple as with K through 12 might have been this idea of had white children ever been replaced in existing all Black schools, you know, it just could have made a different kind of a result in what we call an attempt to desegregate. And I'm sorry, because I don't remember what the question was. Was it about HBCUs? Just about HBCUs? Yeah. Okay. Well, Dr. Anderson pretty much addressed that.
No, I think you made a good point, because if you close a South Carolina state, or if you close an Alabama state or places like that, it's going to have a great adverse impact on K-12 schools for African-American kids. Because and one of the things I discovered in Mississippi was that even though by the time of the 90s or so, when this case was being aired before us, and even though if you looked at the enrollment of Black students in the state of Mississippi in higher education, that Southern Mississippi and Ole Miss and Mississippi State might have numbers at that time that could even be greater than the number of Black students enrolled in Jackson State, Mississippi Valley, and Alcorn. But at that time, 63% of Black students getting college degrees in Mississippi came out of Jackson, Mississippi State, and Alcorn. So the Black college was still providing the greatest share of college degrees. The other thing is, you looked at particular fields like STEM fields and science. The Black colleges are in some cases were the only colleges that were graduating Black students that would go on to graduate school in STEM fields. And so it's all tied in together. That whole system of education, K-12, HBCUs, right. They're all interrelated.
Right.
Dr. Brown, can you talk about constituent districts? I know that came up in the prior conversation. Can you talk about kind of the role and why they were created in the Charleston area? And it is true that we're the probably only district in the country that has this extra layer of governance.
Yeah. Let me just say right now, my answer is going to be a little bit thin. I constituent setup was a result of the ongoing lawsuits that had to be done in Charleston to actually finalize the desegregation process. Attorney Arthur McFarland was the lead counsel on many of those suits. And I think that the constituent structure was in some ways a compromise that was made as a result of those lawsuits. It was about control and who would be the final decision makers about placement, transfer, which schools would close, which would not. And so it was all about how do we maintain power over decision making at a time when these lawsuits were demanding structural change.
And so just for the audience sake and those who may not be in Charleston, when they were created, they actually were localized school districts across our county, which is 1,000 square miles, where they actually had hiring decision-making authority in those local districts. And through consolidation, we have now the Consolidated School Board of Charleston County, which now has all the hiring decision-making body decisions. However, the constituent board still exists, and they are now in charge of attendance zones and suspensions and expulsions at those localized levels. So it's just a layer of governance structure that is very unique to Charleston, and it's due to desegregation.
And it's even deeper than that, because although I do understand that there are efforts being made to change this, right now, the board that makes all the big decisions, the consolidated board, those members are elected regardless of where they live within the area, within the county. So which is to say, I might live in an all-white neighborhood in Mount Pleasant, and I am elected to represent that, but I am voted on by the entire area, the entire county. And so what has happened is you have people waging campaigns and getting on the school board that are not necessarily responsible or answerable to the specific location that they represent. And that is just a political problem that we are really going to have to confront, because this idea that if I have enough money to wage a campaign and I get elected by people who don't look like me, you know, I can use neighborhoods literally 100 miles away to get on this decision-making board, but I'm not answerable to them. And so again, there's a political problem there that shows us that who gets on our school boards and how they get selected is a very, very important issue.
Yes. Tina, I'm going to turn it over to you. We have several audience questions.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Courtney. This is for Dr. Brown, but Dr. Anderson, I'm sure you're going to want to answer this question as well. As you pointed out, we have talked about the need for equity and change for Black students so long, with no result and constantly declining or stagnant outcomes. If you had to name one or two next steps beyond conversation, what would they be?
I'll start off, and it's a big question, Courtney, for sure. I think there is a truth-telling that has to be demanded out of our decision makers. I'm going to just give you a little bit of an example. When I first met the superintendent, Dr. Postlewaite, I said to her, you know, if you're going to really come to this community and talk about change and equity and things that need to be done, I said, we need to remind Charleston that an Avery Institute once existed, where students went, and Dr. Anderson alluded to this earlier, and my father was one of those students that would point to where he took his carpentry class and told me all about who taught him carpentry. And then he would point up at the other window and say, and that's where I had my Latin and my Greek. See, Avery is a local example that I had begged Dr. Postlewaite, use it as our model, that says whether it's all Black, all white, or anything in between, there can be excellence, because Avery was a model of excellence. Number one, academic excellence. Number two, you are telling the community to question itself about its assumptions about Black being inferior. And that's important. That is just psychologically important. Then we're also talking about the idea that we understand that children have different career paths and that we must cater to the different levels, be they technical, craft, academic, or what they call college prep, whatever, artistic. We have to show the same regard and respect for all those different academic pathways. And I wanted Avery being right here in a building that didn't get demolished. You know, it's not a school anymore, but it's a visual that would have said there were Black educators who understood how to do this. And so to answer, you know, Courtney's question, in terms of first steps, there's got to be some truth telling. And people are going to have to stop talking about the socioeconomic deficits of Black people and start resurrecting what about the times when we got it right, you know, and maybe we can be leading on some of these decisions about what kind of schools and what kind of curricula work best for us. But to start that process, there's a humbling that those in authority are going to have to take, thinking that they know better. and that has to be challenged, that no, we don't know all of the answers. Let's see if the people whose lives are directly affected and whose children's lives are directly affected, sometimes negatively, what kind of suggestions do they have? What do they say is needed to make a school really work for them? And I'll back out for now.
Okay.
Jim?
I would only, one of the reasons I've been attracted to some of the things, even in Reconstruction, is to realize that the pursuit of educational equality is essentially a pursuit of political equality. You don't get education equality without political equality, because the old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so what is playing out before our eyes right now with Stacey Abrams and people like that, there's a reason there are lawsuits against Fulton County. There's a reason there's a lawsuit against Philadelphia. There's a reason there's a lawsuit against Milwaukee, is because they continue to disenfranchise the voices that they do not want at the table that would change not only education policy, but health policy, minimum wage and other kinds of policies. And so in our state assemblies, people who divvy out the money and who make decisions about districts and about zoning and about the segregation, we can only affect that through the political process. Lawsuits will only get us so far. We won Brown v. Board of Education. We won the Gaines decision. We won Asby Fordyce. You can win a lot of cases, but it goes back to the assembly that's still making a decision about who gets what.
Right.
And so, you know, what has happened in places like Florida with the ex-felons having the right to vote? How many Black folk are disenfranchised through these rules where once you serve your time, you can't vote? Stacey Abrams has the right project. Get every African-American that's breathing to vote and change the political dynamics, and I'll guarantee you, you get a different education outcome.
Thank you. And this is kind of a follow-up question to what you all are talking about. What suggestions do you have to encourage our Black students to embrace their brilliance? What can schools and school districts do to promote a sense of equity over equality while also embracing community members and parents to be engaged?
I'll start on this one. And then I think one thing I've learned over the years is that in the home, preschool, elementary school, high school, even in college and graduate school, that the one thing that African Americans never hear is that you're brilliant. I mean, people might talk about how nice you are and your personality. They talk about all kinds of things. And here's how I discovered this. I was for about 20 years, I served as coordinator of our graduate program. So I read every application that came in from graduate school. And I began to notice that for the white students that were applying to graduate students, some of their external referees would say things like, this is the most brilliant student I've had in 30 years. And brilliance just kept coming through, and their accomplishments. We'll get to an African-American student who would have the same profile, the same grades, the same everything, and they would talk about what a nice person, a genuine special person. The one thing that does not get said is that this person is also very brilliant. And so we have the capacity, we have the capability, but when that gets denied, and I'll end with a story, very short. There was an undergraduate student in my college, and she was taking an independent study from one of my, another professor who ended up becoming dean of our college. But she got a grade, and the professor told her, I'm not going to accept this because you're better than this. You're much smarter than this. This is not up to your brilliance. And so she didn't accept the paper at the end of the semester. The student came back, was standing in her door in tears, and she thought she'd hurt her feelings because she wouldn't accept it. And the student looked at it and said, I've been in this place for 4 years and no one has ever told me that I was brilliant. So if the silence about our intellect is deafening, the silence about our intellect can be so crushing that no one ever tells you that, yeah, you too are brilliant.
Thank you.
I certainly would agree and concur with that. I'm going to throw something in here that may or may not be directly related to the question, but it's just something I really feel we need to address. When it comes to especially K through 12, we live, as Dr. Anderson said, in a political environment. Politics really is everything. It is very personal. I throw out also that we have to challenge that what is considered to be excellence by standard middle class measures, it may not be all that. We're not talking about academic ability now, but we're seeing the mode of presentation, what we expect of parents, whether or not they come to school during the daytime and whether they participate in PTA. We have all these standards that we put on a very troubled and beat down Black community that is struggling economically, politically, socially, and with all kinds of issues but we have this kind of middle class standard about what makes for a good parent, what's a good method of presentation. What I'm getting at is that there must also be some serious consideration about how quality education doesn't mean we're trying to make Black folks be white people. Okay, and there are some strengths that come out of our community that need to be built upon, and we don't always harness them. We somehow still get caught up in thinking, as my daddy used to say, that white man's ice is always harder and colder. And we've got to challenge that. We know how to educate Black kids. Let's find out about the role of discipline, for example. I am astounded by the fact that more attention is not paid to classroom management, other than throwing somebody out of class. You know, that's the thing that we don't seem to, that's the only thing we know how to do if someone's acting up. You know, we need to be asking some of these folks, these grandparents and these folks at the churches, how do you get those kids to act so well? You know, discipline and respect for authority are very much a part of our society and our heritage. But we don't see that often. And I've seen classrooms where as long as you can just get that little black kid to be quiet, we don't care. You know, because we don't know how to manage the class. So therefore, we just will keep them quiet and keep them entertained and pass them along, because we are not willing to really stand up and challenge and find out how to get them to respond in a more responsible way. So it has a lot to do with what do you know and respect about the historic Black experience that can be borrowed from, as opposed to negated and thrown out and being called, you know, deficient.
I was going to add too is that Millicent reminded me of something I've always thought about, and that is we have to build an infrastructure within the African-American community that recognize African-American brilliance, smart people. I mean, we have, you know, you think about BET, they had things for entertainment and they had things for music.
Right.
There was nothing there to recognize African-American scholars or professors or scientists or whatever. We have to have our own infrastructure. We can't wait on other organizations to recognize our brilliance. We have to build our own infrastructure. It has to go. And I always say is that if there is an African-American football player or basketball player anywhere in America, they know who he is or who she is, and they get them into every institution. If you ask the same people at the same institution, where are the African-American kids in elementary school or middle school or high school that are going to be great scientists, going to be great mathematicians? They look at you like you're crazy. They have no idea. Neither do they have anything built in to find out who they are.
Right.
So we can't leave it to other people to detect and award and promote the brilliance in the African-American community. We need to build our own infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. So building on that, we have a question from Dr. Archon about HBCUs. Both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Brown, what would you say about how to maintain the legacies of quality and excellence in HBCUs for today's climate, when many HBCUs are suffering from a lack of quality and excellence?
One thing, I mean, there are a lot of things, but HBCUs have always had a money problem. And so their ability to do certain things are limited. Joining the Stillman College Board of Trustees, you realize how many of the undergraduate students who simply can't pay their bills, are prevented sometimes from taking exams because they can't pay tuition, have huge amount of money in loans and so forth. And so one, you build an outstanding HBCU by getting the best students in there. High quality students is critical. I mean, it's faculty and other things important as well. But if we can't get top-notch students, so that means we should be behind a loan forgiveness program. We should be behind every effort in the nation so that young people can go to college without building up this great debt as a yoke around their neck. And we should support all the politicians who favor that, because HBCU's survival will depend on their ability to get students into their colleges and not incur the debt that they simply cannot manage. And so they borrow a lot of money, they can't pay the money back, and then their undergraduate enrollment starts to drop as well. It also goes to the kind of faculty that they can hire. You know, with limited resources, there's only so much you can do, and you're competing with every other college in America as well. And so, one, we have to figure out. The other thing is for public universities in particular, even in the Ayers v. Fordyce case, once we won the case, the remedy was very limited. And so the states have to realize that they can't stop because there's one too many zeros in order to do what they should have done. One of the things that really bothers me about attitudes toward HBCUs, I'm talking about the public now, is that for 100 years, you underdevelop and underfund these institutions, and then you propose to close them because they're not up to par. Exactly. It's like having people to pay for their own bullet for an assassination or something. Right. You know, these state governments who have underfunded and underdeveloped HBCUs for over 100 years have a responsibility to provide them with the kind of funding that enable them to attract students with loan forgiveness, being able to pay their tuition, and also to pick off the best faculty to come to these places because they have the salaries and the fringe benefits to do that. And so that's an obligation. On the private side, the alums have to think a lot about contributing every penny that they can toward the endowments of these private universities, because that's what they depend on. That's what keeps them going. And so we do need more alumni given for the private HBCUs.
I'm going to say one thing very quickly. It may seem a little bit extraneous, but I'm just going to say, I hope everybody listening and can spread the word about HR 40. House Resolution 40 is calling for a commission to study reparations. Now, when I was in college, and Jim, I think you would agree to this, when you said the word reparations, people looked at you like you were crazy. Okay, well, here it is 2020, and guess what, folks? It's not crazy. There is a serious federal effort afoot, and we're hoping under Biden we'll gain some more traction. But the reparations that people are talking about, yes, tied to the period of enslavement and Jim Crow and ever since then, falls into this category of what Dr. Anderson is just talking about. That is one of the practical, pragmatic ways that reparations is due for the shortage of funding for these institutions that have been successful in producing the kinds of graduates that we all need. You know, so again, let's just remember, we know things are going on in the bigger world that are connected to education. And they're not all coming out of the Department of Education. We can be aware that we are at a point in this country's history where there's some reckoning trying to happen. And this is one of the cases where it would be an important addition.
And I agree wholeheartedly, because one of the questions that comes up often is, how do we know who to pay? Well,
yeah.
Pay South Carolina State. Pay
South Carolina State.
North Carolina A&T. Pay Tennessee State. I mean, pay the institutions that keep on giving.
Right.
How can you go wrong by, and then there's a federal role, because you know, South Carolina State is a land grant, and the federal government oversaw its underdevelopment. It's not only the state, but the federal government has a responsibility, whether to do it through reparations or don't, even if they don't wait on that. I think Biden should get to work right away with a multi-billion-dollar program that develop institutions that both the federal and state governments have been responsible for their underdevelopment for about 100 years.
Wow, thank you very much. We have time for one more question. During the early years of desegregation in South Carolina, there were many in the African-American community that believed that Black children would be better off by remaining in Black-only schools. How do you think about this line of thought, given the challenges that still exist and the negative impact on young children that were part of this early movement? And also, what facets of school culture before integration are best practices that you think should be lifted or executed in our schools today?
Let me just quickly say that, oh golly, one of the things I make it very clear when I speak to any public group is that one thing about my parents, they tried to teach us that stand up to when you think you've made a mistake, okay? I remember my father being very frustrated by Black folks who weren't supporting the desegregation effort at the time. And he was a big, NAACP, we got to break down those barriers kind of thing. And people were saying, Joe, you better watch it. Because if y'all get into those schools, you might not like what we're going to happen. And I'm here to say that I think if my father were alive today, I know I am here to say it, that I apologize for thinking that those were Uncle Toms, who were saying that. They were not saying that we shouldn't fight, but they were seeing America through a lens that said, you may not like what you are getting, and you may be naive about whether or not white supremacy and resistance is going to go away based on some court cases. And so all these many years later, I am saying, I think we just need to shift the focus. I want to see children go to school together, but that has a lot to do with where you live. Neighborhood patterns are the most important thing about where children go to school. And if you find yourself in a neighborhood that happens to be all Black, I think we need to, stop thinking that's the worst thing in the world and commit to the quality of the experience. What in there, whether it's the music, the history, whether it's the scientific contributions that people of color, of African descent have given to this country. There is no arena. I'm not one who believes in contributionist history, that, respect us because look what we did for America. I just don't think like that. I think we need to understand that America would not be here if not for the things that we did. But that's not where my rights and privileges come from. I'm a tax-paying citizen, so therefore, we need to help people appreciate the extent to which we have been a part of everything. In other words, I don't want to hear about Jackie Robinson and the musicians all the time, as much as I love sports and music. We need to have a much more nuanced understanding of the role that people of African descent have played throughout. And that could be in dance, that could be in theater, in the arts, and in the culinary arts. It's across the board. We really don't have to pigeonhole. I was a consultant for the city of Charleston for their tourism, whatever. And I was just so astounded that they wanted me to prepare parts of their African American history offerings on their website. And I said, wait. Black folks are involved in every square footage in Charleston. Don't start separating out, now here's the Black history. How do we make people understand that you have to tell this fuller, broader, more truthful history, and you've got to integrate it, and I use that word with some reservation, but you've got to get it into every single silo that we call education. And we're in every part of it, so we don't have to go looking for the special parts. We're there already, but we got to do the looking and the searching and the acknowledgement.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, okay. When I think about the desegregation efforts, and particularly in the South, that didn't happen until 1968 until now. If I had to give a grade to America's experiment in desegregation, it would be no better than a D.
Yeah.
No better
If
than a
that.
D. But I also would say that desegregation failed not because it was bound to fail. It failed because people wanted it to fail, and choices been made. In a lot of places, they decide to do segregation as a punishment. And you got these court mandates, we're gonna make you pay. And that's why you have the wholesale dismissal of African-American teachers by the tens of thousands. You're gonna lose your teachers. There was a study in North Carolina where there was something like 76 African-American principals of high schools. And in the year following the desegregation, there was only 2. You're gonna lose all your principals. And so we are still having to wrestle with the article that Du Bois wrote when he, and the title was, Does the Negro Need Separate Schools? And he was castigated even by African-American activists at the time.
Right. That's right.
But if you read it very carefully, Du Bois said, what is your choice between an African-American school with a principal and teachers and fellow students that care about you and will protect you, or in a desegregated school where you're not wanted and it's hostile and you're suspended and you're treated so badly? Which choice would you make?
And you drive people like me to be crazy in their adulthood.
And so you have to ask anybody, what choice would you make? And I think any rational person would say, I would choose the school where the kids are taken care of and are promoted and fostered. And some of the things we've been talking about earlier, well, teachers do tell them that they're smart and they're okay. I don't want them to go to places. Sean Hopper did a study on suspension of African-American kids in school districts. There are school districts in the South where 100% of kids who are suspended are African-American. And you said not even by accident that one white student doesn't get suspended? I learned to my surprise that 54% of kids who are suspended from preschool in America are African-American. We're talking about 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds.
Let me jump in, Jim, because I know we got to end this. But again, locally, we have to understand that when it was exposed that the academic magnet had like 18 Black students out of 800 or whatever it is, and I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures, somebody wasn't paying attention. You know, that was not by accident. That, you know, we didn't get to this kind of disparity and imbalance, you know, because it just came out of nowhere. Somebody wasn't paying attention that your best schools, supposedly your best schools, had almost no Black kids. You know, and so we've got to get to the point where we're demanding that keep your eye on this, keep your eye on the statistics, whether it's the discipline statistics or whether it's the admissions statistics, whatever. But your job being in the school system is to call attention to the fact of paying attention who's not here. Who's not here? Then something's wrong. What have we not done correctly? and then address it and do something about that.
Well, thank you so much. We could listen to the two of you all day. You've given us so much incredible food for thought. So thank you so much for your beautiful and thoughtful responses to all of the questions. And thank you to everyone for asking your questions. Lavonda?
Yes, well, thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you for everyone who has held on with us to get this fantastic information. I feel like I could sit at your feet and just listen, as Tina said, continuously and have these learning lessons. So I won't belabor the time. I know we've gone over a little bit, but it was well worth it. And again, thank you for those who continued on with us. I want to thank our partners, E3 and Tri-County Cradle to Career. It's been an honor to work on this speaker series. And we have, well, first of all, I just want to thank Dr. Anderson really quickly. Thank you for the historical context that you set on literacy for enslaved and free Blacks and the consequences of those who supported it in the early days, and just that evolution of literacy and the free schools. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for putting a face to the desegregation movement and for reminding us of the psychological consequences, as well as the psychological barriers that we face. So, and thank you for encouraging us to not only look for the truth, but look for the untruth, because we have to change the narrative. And until we find whether the truth was left out or misrepresented intentionally or unintentionally, we have to look for the truth and we have to change the narrative. So thank you very much for that. So as for next steps, do we have a slide? If not, we are moving forward with our speaker series. We'll have a conversation about data on December the 10th with Dr. Ivory Tolson, President and CEO of Quality Education for Minorities Network and author of No BS, No Bad Stats. And also we'll be joined by Ms. Ashley Quetchi-Shaw, who is the Managing Director and Lead Researcher for Intermedia Planning, LLC. We are also working on developing a community-wide definition of an anti-racist organization, and we'll be partnering with folks in the community who are part of this anti-racist ecosystem on moving towards action and taking all of these conversations. As Dr. Brown reminded us, we know that the data is there, the information is there, we understand these things, we know these things, so why have we yet to move the needle? So that is where we're moving. That is the direction that we're going in. So you will see the contacts on screen for any of those of us who are involved in this project. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next speaker series. Thank you so much.